There is a story about a restaurant owner in a flood zone that perfectly explains the mechanics of political power. When the forecast predicted a massive, catastrophic flood, this owner didn't board up his windows or stack sandbags. Instead, he did something that looked insane to his neighbors. He went down to his basement, turned on every tap, and deliberately flooded his own restaurant with clean, clear municipal water. He filled the room from the floor to the ceiling until the pressure inside was immense. Why? Because of hydrostatic pressure. He knew that the dirty, toxic floodwaters outside were going to push against his walls with crushing force. If the inside of his house was empty, if it was just air, the walls would buckle, the glass would shatter, and the sludge would pour in, destroying everything. But by filling the space with his own water first, he created an internal pressure that pushed back. The clean water acted as a shield. When the flood receded days later, his walls were standing. He just drained the clean water, dried the floors, and reopened. This is a brilliant survival hack for a building, but it is also the exact, terrifying logic used by military officers when they decide to overthrow a government. Welcome to the architecture of a coup. We often look at history, especially the turbulent history of post-colonial Africa, and we see chaos. We see generals in sunglasses, tanks in the streets, and radio broadcasts announcing a new regime. We call them warlords or dictators. But if you look at the internal logic, the hidden mechanics of the men who start these fires, they don't see themselves as villains. They see themselves as that restaurant owner. They look at their nation and see the dirty water rising outside. They see corruption, foreign influence, economic rot, and political paralysis pushing against the walls of the state. They believe that the only way to save the structure is to flood it from the inside to fill the halls of power with their own clean force, the military, to equalize the pressure and keep the rot out. Today, we are going to deconstruct this blueprint. We are going to look at the life hack of the military coup, specifically focusing on the explosive year of 1966 in Nigeria and the subsequent house cleaning exercises in Ghana. We will see how this physics experiment works in the real world and why, unlike the restaurant, flooding a nation almost always causes the foundation to rot. To understand the pressure, we have to look at the vessel. In the early 1960s, Nigeria was known as the Giant of Africa. It was vast, populous, and rich in resources. But the structure was built on a fault line. The British had amalgamated hundreds of different ethnic groups, the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, the Igbo in the east, into a single administrative unit. When the British left in 1960, they didn't leave behind a unified nation. They left behind a power vacuum. By 1965, the dirty water was rising. The political class was viewed by the military and the educated elite not as leaders, but as parasites. They were derisively called the 10%ers politicians, who would demand a 10% kickback on any government contract. If you wanted to build a road, a school, or a hospital, 10% of the budget went into a minister's pocket. The elections were rigged, the census was faked to inflate regional power, and the western region was in a state of violent anarchy known as wetai, where political opponents were doused in petrol and set on fire. The walls of the house were buckling. Enter the clean water. In the barracks, a group of young, idealistic, and highly educated majors began to talk. They were led by a charismatic, ascetic officer named Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogwu. Nzeogwu was not a man who enjoyed the excesses of the political class. He didn't drink. When Nzeogwu stormed the lodge of the Sardana, the most powerful man in northern Nigeria, it wasn't a negotiation. It was an eradication. The goal was to decapitate the political leadership entirely so that the military could step in and reset the system. The next morning, Nzeogwu took to the radio. His speech is one of the most famous in African history, and it perfectly encapsulates the life hack mentality. He didn't sound like a man who had just committed treason. He sounded like a janitor explaining why he had to use harsh chemicals on a stain. He declared, "Our enemies are the political profiteers, the swindlers, the men in high and low places that seek bribes and demand 10%. Those that seek to keep the country divided permanently so that they can remain in office as ministers or VIPs at least, the tribalists, the nepotists." He was selling the vision of the clean flood. He promised a unitary government, an end to regional bickering, and a nation based on merit. For a brief, fleeting moment, the streets erupted in joy. The newspapers hailed them as heroes. The 10%ers were gone. The house had been flooded, and the pressure was equalized. But here is where the physics of a coup differs from the physics of a basement. Water is neutral. Water doesn't have a tribe. Water doesn't have a religion. Water doesn't have a history. People do. The clean water that Zaire used to flood the system wasn't viewed as neutral by everyone. While the coup leaders claimed to be acting for the nation, the optics told a different story. Most of the coup plotters were Igbo from the east. Most of the leaders they killed were Hausa Fulani from the north or Yoruba from the west. To the north, this wasn't a cleaning. This was a conquest. They didn't see a restaurant owner saving the building. They saw a rival tribe, drowning them in their own homes. The structural integrity of Nigeria didn't hold. It shattered. The man who ended up taking power wasn't Nzeogwu. The coup actually failed to secure total control, but the highest-ranking officer, General Aguiyi Ironsi. Ironsi tried to maintain the seal. He abolished the regions and tried to create a unitary state. He tried to force the water to stay in the room, but the pressure was too high. The North simmered. They felt humiliated. They felt that the clean water was actually poison. Rumors began to fly. Rumors of a conspiracy to wipe out the northern elite entirely. The life hack had triggered a reaction that no one in the planning room had accounted for. Human emotion. 6 months later, the walls didn't just buckle. They exploded. This leads us to the rematch, the counter-coup of July 1966. If January was a surgical strike intended to clean the system, July was a chaotic, vengeful flood of muddy water. Northern officers, led by a young lieutenant colonel named Yakubu Gowon, though he was a reluctant leader, turned on their Igbo colleagues. The barracks became slaughterhouses. The discipline that Nzeogwu prized the idea that the military was a clean institution evaporated. Soldiers were shooting their own officers based on their ethnicity. The clean water had become contaminated with the very same tribalism and hatred that the politicians had used. Yakubu Gowon took power, but the damage was done. The eastern region, led by Lieutenant Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu, looked at the new government and said, "We are not safe in this house anymore." Ojukwu, a man of immense intellect and Oxford education, saw the flood coming from the north, the pogroms, the riots, the killing of Igbos, and he decided to build his own house. He declared the secession of the eastern region. He called it Biafra. This is the ultimate failure of the coup as a life hack. The intention was to unify the country by force, to hold it together against corruption. The result was the Nigerian Civil War, a conflict that would last 3 years, claim millions of lives, and introduce the world to the horrific weapon of starvation as a tactic of war. But the blueprint didn't die in Nigeria. The idea that you can clean a nation by flooding it with military force is addictive. It spread. Let's move across the continent to Ghana. If Nigeria was the tragedy of the blueprint, Ghana was the obsession with it. Ghana had been the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain independence, led by the visionary Kwame Nkrumah. But by 1966, just weeks after the Nigerian coup, Nkrumah was overthrown. For the next decade, Ghana went through a revolving door of generals. But in 1979, a flight lieutenant named Jerry John Rawlings appeared. And Rawlings took the cleaning metaphor literally. He didn't call his takeover a revolution initially. He called it a house cleaning exercise. Rawlings looked at the generals who had been running Ghana, the men who were supposed to be the clean water, and he saw that they had become the dirty water. They were hoarding wealth, manipulating the currency, and starving the people. So Rawlings decided to flush the entire system. This wasn't just a change of guard, it was a purge. In June 1979, the Rawlings regime did something unprecedented. They rounded up 3 former heads of state: General Afrifa, General Achiampong, and General Akufo, along with other high-ranking officers. They tied them to stakes at the Teshi firing range, and they executed them. Rawlings argued that for the house to be clean, the people responsible for the rot had to be physically removed. It was a brutal application of the hydrostatic pressure theory. He believed that by showing that even the highest big men could be touched, he would permanently sanitize the political culture of Ghana. Did it work? In the short term, it created a shockwave of terror and compliance. Prices in the markets dropped because traders were terrified of being whipped by soldiers. Corruption went underground. The seal held for a moment. But you cannot govern by flood forever. Eventually, the water has to recede. You have to dry the floor and open the restaurant. And when you do, you realize that the water has warped the wood. The institutions, the courts, the press, the civil service are damaged by the very force used to save them. Rawlings eventually had to transition to democracy, swapping his flight suit for a traditional cloth, realizing that a permanent state of emergency is not a government. Now, let's look at the most extreme version of this seal. The version where the leader decides that the only way to keep the dirty water out is to change the very identity of the house itself. We go to the Congo. Joseph Désiré Mobutu took power in a coup in 1965, ending the chaotic crisis that saw the assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Mobutu looked at the Congo, a nation scarred by the brutal colonialism of King Leopold II and the Belgians, and he decided that the rot was Western influence. His solution was a campaign called Authenticité. The war ended in 1970 with the surrender of Biafra. Gowon declared, "No victor, no vanquished," a magnanimous gesture intended to heal the wounds. But the scars remained. The trust between the regions had been shattered. The military had become the dominant force in Nigerian politics, a legacy that would last for decades. The life hack had fundamentally altered the DNA of the nation. The military was no longer just a tool of the state. It was the state. Now, let's shift our focus back to Ghana and the long-term effects of Rawlings' house cleaning. Rawlings eventually transitioned Ghana to democracy in 1992, becoming the first president of the Fourth Republic. This was a rare move for a military leader. Usually, they cling to power until they are forced out or die. But Rawlings understood that the flood had to recede. However, the psychological impact of his rule lingered. The execution of the former heads of state remained a controversial and painful memory. The culture of silence that had developed during the military era took years to dissipate. People were afraid to speak out, afraid to criticize the government. The clean water had washed away the immediate corruption, but it had also eroded the foundations of civil society. It took decades for Ghana to rebuild its democratic institutions and foster a culture of open debate. And what of Mobutu and Zaire? Mobutu's rule ended in 1997, not with a peaceful transition, but with another violent flood. Laurent Désiré Kabila, backed by Rwanda and Uganda, marched across the country and toppled the dictator. Mobutu fled into exile and died shortly after. But the house he left behind was in ruins. The infrastructure was non-existent. The economy was shattered. The people were impoverished. The Authenticité campaign had failed to create a strong, unified nation. Instead, it had created a hollow shell that collapsed at the first sign of pressure. The subsequent wars in the Congo were a direct result of this vacuum. The clean water of Mobutu's nationalism had turned into a toxic sludge of warlordism and resource exploitation. So, what can we learn from these historical examples? First, that the life hack of a military coup is a dangerous illusion. It promises a quick fix to complex problems, but it almost always creates new, unforeseen complications. The clean water is never truly clean. It carries with it the biases, ambitions, and flaws of the people who unleash it. But the tragedy is that the coup itself often creates a new spiral. The Nzeogwu coup created the spiral of ethnic suspicion that led to the Civil War. The Rawlings coup created a spiral of violent retribution. The Mobutu coup created a spiral of absolute corruption. The clean water becomes the new flood. The saviors become the new tyrants. And the house, which was supposed to be saved, is left with water damage that takes generations to repair. The restaurant owner in our opening story knew one thing that dictators often forget. The flood is supposed to be temporary. You fill the room to survive the crisis, but then you must drain it. You must let the air back in. You must let the people breathe. If you keep the house flooded forever, you don't save it. You drown it. This is the hidden mechanic of power. It is seductive to think that we can fix a broken system with a single, decisive act of force. It appeals to our desire for order. But history shows us that the most dangerous time for any nation is not when the floodwaters are rising outside. but when the people inside decide to open the taps. The story of the life hack coup doesn't end with the initial flood. It continues into the aftermath, where the water damage reveals itself in unexpected ways. Let's look at the specific case of the Nigerian Civil War, which was the direct result of the 1966 coups. The clean water of the January coup had turned into the muddy water of the July counter-coup, and now the house was split in two. The eastern region, under Ojukwu, declared itself the Republic of Biafra. They believed they could build a new, smaller, more resilient house. But the federal government, led by Gowon, saw this as a structural failure that had to be corrected at all costs. The war that followed was brutal. It wasn't just a military conflict, it was a siege. The federal government implemented a blockade of Biafra. They cut off food, medicine, and supplies. This was the starvation tactic. Images of starving children with distended bellies kwashiorkor flooded the world's media. This was the first time many people in the West saw the horrific reality of African conflict on their televisions. It sparked a massive humanitarian response, but it also highlighted the devastating cost of the life hack. The coup leaders had tried to save the nation from corruption, but their actions had led to a situation where millions were dying of hunger. The cure had become worse than the disease. He didn't just flood the government with soldiers, he flooded the culture with a new, enforced identity. He changed the name of the country from Congo to Zaire. He changed the name of the capital. He changed his own name from Joseph Desire Mobutu to Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ingbendu Wazabanga, which roughly translates to the all-powerful warrior, who because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. He banned Western suits. He forced men to wear the abacos, a Mao-style tunic. He banned Christian names. This was a psychological coup. Mobutu was trying to create a hermetic seal around his nation. He believed that if he could strip away every vestige of the colonial past, he could create a pure, strong vessel that couldn't be penetrated by outside forces. But while he was painting the outside of the house with this nationalist authenticity, the inside was rotting faster than ever. Mobutu became the archetype of the kleptocrat. He treated the national treasury as his personal bank account. He chartered Concorde jets for shopping trips to Paris while his people starved. The clean water he used to flood the country was actually acid. It ate through the infrastructure until Zaire was a shell, a massive, hollow state held together only by the fear of the all-powerful warrior. When the pressure finally broke in the 1990s, it didn't just leak, it collapsed into the First and Second Congo Wars. A conflict so devastating, it involved 9 African nations and resulted in millions of deaths. The seal of authenticity had hidden a complete structural collapse. So, what is the lesson of the blueprint? Why does the life hack fail when applied to nations? The failure lies in the misunderstanding of the glitch. In nature, there is a phenomenon known as the ant death spiral. Army ants are blind. They follow the chemical pheromone trail of the ant in front of them. Usually, this leads them to food or back to the nest. But sometimes, a glitch happens. The lead ant gets confused and loops back on its own trail. The ants behind him follow. They begin to march in a tight, perfect circle. They will march in this circle, round and round, until they die of exhaustion. They are following the rules. They are doing exactly what they are programmed to do. But the system has locked them into a death loop. A military coup is often an attempt to break a death spiral. The soldiers see the politicians marching the country into ruin, and they intervene to break the circle. Second, that true stability comes not from force, but from institutions. A nation is not a building that can be saved by flooding it. It is a living organism that needs to breathe, to grow, and to adapt. When you try to force it into a rigid shape, you kill it. And finally, that the hidden mechanics of power are often driven by simple, human emotions: fear, pride, greed, and the desire for control. The leaders who launch coups are not abstract villains. They are people reacting to pressure, often with disastrous consequences. The restaurant owner in our opening story saved his building because he understood the physics of water. But nations are not made of bricks and mortar. They are made of people. And people are far more complex, far more unpredictable, and far more fragile than any building. When we look at history, We must look beyond the headlines and the official narratives. We must look for the hidden mechanics, the underlying forces that drive events. We must understand the glitch in the system, the death spiral of conflict, and the seductive but dangerous allure of the life hack. Only then can we truly understand the world we live in. Only then can we see the clarity in the chaos. This is the Clarity Nocturne.